Whose account is this? Marcus Kane's voice was quiet, which was always the moment his executives feared most. He stood in the doorway of the estate's security office at 6:40 in the morning, still in his running clothes, staring at a wire transfer report that made no sense. Every week, without exception, his housekeeper Naomi Baxter's entire paycheck left her account within an hour of landing in it. Not to rent, not to groceries, not to debt collectors. To a children's shelter 2 boroughs away, one payment at a time, never missing a single week in over a year. Marcus had built an empire on knowing exactly where every dollar in his world went. He had never once looked at hers. The head of his security team, a broad, quiet man named Elias Cho, cleared his throat. It flagged automatically, sir. Recurring transfer, same amount, same day, for 14 months. The system pulls anything over 90% of monthly income, leaving an account within 24 hours. Standard flag for money laundering or coercion. Coercion, Marcus repeated. We don't know that yet. Marcus set the report down slowly. 14 months. Naomi Baxter had worked in his home for almost 3 years. She arrived before the kitchen staff, left after the night security shift changed, and had never once asked for a raise, a day off during a holiday, or an explanation for anything he did. She simply worked, quietly, competently, invisibly, the way good staff were trained to. He had never wondered what she did with her money. That should have bothered him more than it did. Pull everything, he said, quietly. I want to know exactly where that money goes and why, before I ask her directly. Elias hesitated. And if it's coercion? If someone's forcing her? Marcus's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way it always did right before he made a decision that would end badly for somebody. Then I want their name before breakfast. Naomi Baxter had learned a long time ago that the safest place in any room was the corner nobody looked at. She had worked in wealthy homes since she was 19, first as a part-time cleaner for a hotel chain, then as a private housekeeper for a judge's family, and now, for the last 3 years, as head of household staff for Marcus Kane, a man whose name alone could silence a restaurant. She had learned the rhythms of his house the way a musician learns a difficult piece, patiently, exactly, without ever drawing attention to the effort it took. She knew which rooms he preferred left dark in the mornings. She knew he took his coffee black, except on days after a business trip, when he wanted 2 sugars and never explained why. She knew the difference between his silence when he was thinking and his silence when he was furious, and she had learned to move carefully around both. What none of the other staff knew, what she had never told anyone in this house, was where her paycheck went every single week. On Friday mornings, before her shift began, Naomi took the express train 2 boroughs east to a squat brick building with peeling white trim called the Riverside Children's Shelter. She walked in through the side door, past the intake desk, past the cafeteria where 30 or 40 kids ate breakfast before school, and into the small back office where a tired woman named Patricia Reyes ran the entire operation on a budget that shouldn't have kept the lights on. You don't have to keep doing this, Patricia said. The same thing she said every single week, taking the folded envelope Naomi held out to her. I know, Naomi said. The same thing she said every single week. It's your whole paycheck. I know that too. Patricia sighed, the way she always did, and slid the envelope into the shelter's lockbox without opening it. She had stopped arguing about it a long time ago. She understood, better than most people ever could, exactly why Naomi Baxter had never missed a week. 11 years earlier, Naomi had been a resident there herself. 15 years old, underweight, terrified, dropped off by a caseworker after her mother's boyfriend put her in the hospital for the second time. She remembered the exact bed she'd slept in, the exact volunteer who had sat with her the first night when she couldn't stop shaking, the exact meal, spaghetti with garlic bread, that had been the first food she'd eaten in 2 days without flinching. Riverside hadn't just given her a place to sleep. It had given her 3 years of stability long enough to finish high school, to apply for jobs, to become someone capable of building a life instead of just surviving one. She had never forgotten what that cost the people running it, and she had promised herself, the day she left, that she would repay it in full someday. She had been repaying it, one paycheck at a time, for 14 months, ever since Riverside's funding had been cut by nearly 40%, and Patricia had quietly mentioned, not asking for anything, that they might have to turn kids away for the first time in the shelter's history. Naomi lived on almost nothing. She kept a single room in a converted row house 15 minutes from Kane Estate, ate most of her meals in the staff kitchen where food was already provided, and had not bought herself a new coat in 3 winters. Nobody asked her about it. Nobody noticed. That was, until a Thursday afternoon in late October, when Marcus Kane knocked on the door of his own housekeeper's supply closet office and asked her to sit down. Naomi's stomach dropped the second she saw his face. He had never come to find her personally. He had never needed to. "Mr. Kane." She stood immediately, smoothing her apron. "Is something wrong with the house?" "No." He closed the door behind him, which he had also never done. "Sit down, Naomi." She sat, hands folding automatically in her lap, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being braced for bad news. Marcus remained standing, holding a single sheet of paper he didn't immediately show her. "I need to ask you something, and I want the truth, not the version you think I want to hear." "Of course. Every week for the last 14 months, your entire paycheck has left your account within an hour of being deposited." He watched her face carefully as he said it. "It goes to the same place every time, a children's shelter." Naomi's hands tightened in her lap. For a moment she said nothing at all, and Marcus recognized the silence immediately, because it was the exact silence people used when they were deciding how much of the truth was safe to give. "You've been monitoring my bank account," she said finally, quietly. "The system flags unusual transfer patterns automatically. I didn't go looking for this. That was mostly true. But once I saw it, I wasn't going to ignore it. Why not? It's my money. Because you give away every dollar you earn, and you've never once asked me for anything in return. And in my experience," he said carefully, "people who behave like that are either the most honest people I've ever met, or they're protecting someone dangerous who's taking it from them." He finally held up the paper. "I need to know which one it is." For a long moment, Naomi looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, not fear exactly, but the exhausted resignation of someone who had spent years keeping a story small enough that no one would ever ask about it, and now had run out of room to keep hiding it. "Nobody's taking anything from me," she said. "I give it away because I want to. 14 months, Naomi. Every cent. Because 11 years ago that shelter is the only reason I'm alive to be sitting in this chair." Her voice didn't shake, but it dropped. Quieter, steadier. The voice of someone laying down a weight she had carried alone for a very long time. "I lived there for 3 years, starting when I was 15. They fed me, they kept me safe, they helped me finish school when I had nowhere else to go. Their funding got cut last year. I'm not going to sit here in this house eating food I don't have to pay for while kids like I was get turned away because nobody thought their beds were worth keeping the lights on for." Marcus stood completely still. He had interrogated men who ran multi-million-dollar smuggling operations. He had sat across negotiating tables from senators and shipping magnates, and men who would have killed him without blinking if the numbers had favored it. He had learned, over decades, to read exactly how much truth was in a person's voice. There was no performance in what Naomi had just told him. There was only fact, delivered with the flat, practiced calm of someone who had explained it to herself so many times that the pain had long since been folded into routine. "You've been living on almost nothing," he said slowly. "For over a year. I've lived on less. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She looked down at her hands. "I know it probably sounds foolish to someone like you. It's not a large sum, in the world you live in, but it's the difference between that shelter staying open or not, and I'd rather go without a few things than let that happen." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, at eye level, the way he had not done with an employee in longer than he could remember. "I owe you an apology," he said. Naomi blinked. "For what?" "For not knowing this 3 years ago." He set the transfer report on the desk between them. "You've worked in my house since you were 24. I know your schedule down to the minute. I know exactly how you take your coffee and which rooms you avoid, because the memory of them still makes you flinch, and until an hour ago, I had absolutely no idea you were the most selfless person under my roof." He shook his head slightly. "That's a failure on my part, not yours. You don't owe your housekeeper anything, Mr. Kane. I think I do." He stood again, folding the report and slipping it into his jacket. "I'd like you to keep this between us for now." "Can you do that?" Naomi frowned. "Why?" "Because I have some questions I need answered before I do anything about it." Marcus said, and something in his voice had gone flat and careful in a way she had learned over 3 years to recognize as dangerous. And I don't yet know who else in this house already knows. What Naomi didn't know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that her name had already come up once before that week, in a conversation nowhere near as kind as the one she'd just had. 3 days earlier, in a private dining room at the top of Kane Tower, Marcus's cousin Damon Whitfield had sat across from a woman named Renata Cole, the daughter of one of Marcus's oldest business partners, discussing an upcoming $200 million merger that would fold 3 smaller shipping firms under the Kane Industries banner. Damon had spent 11 years as Marcus's chief financial strategist, the man responsible for structuring every major deal the family made. On paper, he was brilliant, loyal, and utterly trusted. In reality, for the past 2 years, Damon had been quietly siphoning funds through a maze of shell accounts disguised as charitable partnerships, moving small percentages off every transaction Marcus approved, confident that no one would ever look closely enough at accounts too small to matter. Riverside Children's Shelter was one of them. Not because Damon cared about the shelter, because 2 years earlier, before Naomi had ever started sending her paycheck there, Damon had used Riverside as one of several small nonprofit accounts to launder skimmed funds, routing money in and out in amounts too modest to trigger any serious audit. Confident that a struggling charity, desperate for donations, would never ask uncomfortable questions about where its money came from. He had not anticipated that a housekeeper working in Marcus Kane's own home would start funneling her personal paycheck into that same account every single week, creating a transaction history detailed enough that if anyone with financial expertise ever looked closely, patterns would surface that were never meant to be found. "The Riverside account needs to close," Damon said quietly, sliding a folder across the table to Renata. "Quietly. Before the merger audit next month. You said it was clean. It was clean for the amounts I was using. It's not clean anymore." He tapped the folder. "Someone's making regular deposits from what looks like a personal account. If Marcus's auditors ever pull that shelter's records for any reason, they're going to find 14 months of transaction history sitting right on top of what I moved through it 2 years ago." Renata frowned. Whose account? Damon hadn't known at that point. It had taken him 2 more days and a contact inside the bank to find out. When the name came back, he had gone very still, staring at it for a long moment before setting it down. Naomi Baxter, Marcus's own housekeeper. It was, Damon realized almost immediately, both a serious problem and an extraordinary opportunity, depending entirely on how he handled it. "There's a maid in Marcus's house who's been feeding money into that account for over a year," he told Renata the next evening, his voice carefully casual. "If Marcus ever finds out about the account and traces it back to her, it won't take him long to find what's underneath it. So we solve 2 problems at once. Meaning? Meaning she gets fired before Marcus ever looks closely enough to ask questions. A theft accusation would be cleanest. Staff get accused of skimming from household accounts all the time. Nobody blinks. She's gone. The account gets quietly folded and closed as part of the transition, and there's nothing left connecting the shelter to anything that happened 2 years ago." Renata studied him. "And if Marcus actually likes her, trusts her, he trusts staff the way he trusts furniture," Damon said. "Reliable, invisible, replaceable. He won't ask a second question if the paperwork looks clean." He smiled thinly. "I'll make sure it does." What neither of them accounted for was the fact that Marcus Kane had grown up in a house where trust was the single most carefully guarded currency in his family, and he had learned, from a very young age, never to accept the first version of a story handed to him, no matter how clean the paperwork looked. 2 days after his conversation with Naomi, Marcus sat across from Elias Cho in the same security office, a stack of financial records spread across the table between them. "I need everything on the Riverside Children's Shelter account," Marcus said. "Full history, every deposit, every withdrawal, going back 3 years. Elias raised an eyebrow but didn't ask why. He had worked for Marcus long enough to know that questions came after results, not before. 6 hours later, he returned with a folder considerably thicker than either of them had expected. "There's something strange in here," Elias said, spreading the documents across the desk. "Naomi Baxter's deposits are exactly what you'd expect. Consistent, clean, traceable directly to her paycheck." He flipped to another section. "But 2 years ago, Before she started contributing, there's a completely different pattern. Irregular deposits, oddly specific amounts, routed through 3 intermediary accounts before landing at the shelter. Marcus leaned forward. Show me. Elias laid out a timeline. Deposits of $14,220, $9,875, $22,410. Numbers with no obvious relationship to any charitable donation pattern, moving through accounts registered to shell companies, with names like Brightline Logistics Partners and Meridian Family Foundation, entities that existed on paper and nowhere else. Those shells trace back to accounts used in 3 of our shipping transactions from 2 years ago, Elias said quietly. Small percentages, skimmed off legitimate deals, laundered through a handful of charitable fronts before disappearing. Marcus's jaw tightened. Who had signing authority on those transactions? Elias hesitated, and that hesitation told Marcus everything he needed to know before the name was even spoken. Damon, Elias said. Every one of them went through Damon's office. Marcus sat back slowly. For a long moment he said nothing, staring at the timeline laid out in front of him, watching 2 completely separate stories. His housekeeper's quiet, desperate generosity, and his own cousin's quiet, calculated theft, collide inside the same modest bank account without either of them ever knowing it. He's been stealing from me for 2 years, Marcus said finally. It looks that way. And Naomi's paycheck has been sitting on top of the evidence the entire time. Marcus almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. She thinks she's saving a shelter. She has no idea she's the only reason there's a paper trail detailed enough to catch him. Elias frowned. If Damon realizes that, he already has. Marcus stood abruptly, pulling his jacket from the back of the chair. That's why he's going to try to get rid of her before I ever connect the two. He was right. 4 days later, at a gala hosted at Kane Tower to celebrate the upcoming merger, Naomi Baxter stood near the edge of the ballroom in her staff uniform, quietly directing catering trays toward the correct tables, when Damon Whitfield approached with a folder in one hand and an expression of practiced concern. Miss Baxter. His voice was pleasant, professional, the kind of tone people used right before delivering devastating news dressed up as procedure. Could I speak with you privately for a moment? Naomi followed him into a side hallway, confused but not yet alarmed. Damon closed the door partway behind them. There's an issue with the household accounts, he said. Specifically, discrepancies traced back to expenditures under your name. Naomi's stomach dropped. What kind of discrepancies? Unauthorized transfers. 14 months of them, in fact. Damon opened the folder, showing her printed transaction records, her own transfers to Riverside, framed carefully out of context, presented as though they were something else entirely. Mr. Kane's accounting team flagged a consistent pattern of funds leaving household-adjacent accounts without proper authorization. I'm sorry to say, given the pattern and the amounts, this is being treated as a potential theft matter. That's my own paycheck, Naomi said immediately, her voice sharpening with disbelief. I've never touched a household account in my life. That money is mine. I send it to a children's shelter. That's certainly one explanation. Damon's tone remained mild, almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. Unfortunately, given the sensitivity around the merger closing next week, we can't afford any appearance of financial irregularity connected to household staff. I'm sorry, Miss Baxter, but effective today, your position here is terminated. Security will assist you in collecting your belongings. Naomi stared at him, the ground seeming to tilt slightly beneath her feet. 3 years of quiet, careful work, 3 years of never once asking for anything, and it was ending in a hallway with a folder full of her own charity, to a children's shelter, twisted into an accusation of theft. Does Mr. Kane know about this? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Kane trusts his financial team to handle matters like this, Damon said smoothly. I assure you, this decision has his full backing. It did not. But Damon was counting on the fact that Naomi, like every member of household staff before her, would assume a man as powerful as Marcus Kane had neither the time nor the interest to personally verify what he was told about people he considered replaceable. He had badly miscalculated. Marcus was in his office 2 floors above when Elias burst in without knocking, a habit he reserved only for genuine emergencies. Damon just terminated Naomi Baxter. Marcus was on his feet before Elias finished the sentence. On what grounds? Theft. He's telling her it's an authorized decision, using your name. For the second time in a week, something behind Marcus Kane's eyes went very still and very cold. The expression his enemies had learned, over the years, to fear more than shouting ever could. Where is she now? Being escorted out through the service entrance. And Damon? Downstairs. In the ballroom, getting ready to open the merger toast. Marcus straightened his jacket, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something that almost resembled a smile crossed his face, though it held no warmth at all. Good, he said. Let him. The ballroom of Kane Tower glittered with the particular brightness reserved for deals worth $200 million. Executives from 3 shipping firms mingled with investors, attorneys, and a scattering of the city's wealthiest families, all gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to celebrate a merger that would, on paper, make everyone in the room significantly richer by morning. Damon Whitfield stood near the podium at the front of the room, tapping his glass gently to draw attention as the orchestra quieted. Renata Cole stood near the front, offering him a small, encouraging nod. Everything, as far as either of them knew, was proceeding exactly as planned. Ladies and gentlemen, Damon began, raising his glass. On behalf of Kane Industries, I want to thank each of you for... The ballroom doors opened. Marcus Kane walked in, and the entire room shifted the way it always did when he entered a space. Conversations quieting, postures straightening, every person present suddenly, instinctively aware of exactly who held the most power in the building. He crossed the floor without hurrying, and Damon's confident expression faltered slightly as he watched his cousin approach the podium directly, rather than taking his usual seat at the head table. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Marcus said, taking the microphone from Damon's hand with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "But before we celebrate anything tonight, there's a matter that needs to be addressed." Damon forced a smile. "Marcus, perhaps this isn't the moment." "It's exactly the moment." Marcus turned to face the room, 200 of the city's most powerful people watching in confused silence. "An hour ago, a member of my household staff, a woman who has worked in my home for 3 years without a single complaint against her, was fired and accused of theft." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Damon's smile had disappeared entirely. "The accusation," Marcus continued, "was based on 14 months of financial transfers, every single one traceable, documented, and entirely legitimate. Her own paycheck, sent every week to a children's shelter where she lived as a teenager after escaping an abusive home." His eyes moved to Damon, and his voice, though it never rose, carried a weight that silenced every remaining conversation in the room. What that accusation conveniently failed to mention was what else was found underneath those transfers. He nodded toward the back of the ballroom, where Elias Cho stood beside a large presentation screen, originally set up to display the merger's financial projections. The screen came alive instead with a different set of documents entirely: shell company registrations, intermediary accounts, a timeline of skimmed funds routed through Riverside Children's Shelter 2 years before Naomi Baxter had ever started working there, every transaction signed off, ultimately, under Damon Whitfield's authority. The room fell into absolute silence. "For 2 years," Marcus said, "my cousin has been stealing from every transaction he personally structured, laundering the proceeds through charitable fronts he assumed no one would ever look at closely." He glanced toward the screen. He very nearly got away with it, until a housekeeper who had no idea any of this existed started sending her own paycheck into the exact same account, week after week, creating a transaction history detailed enough that when my security team finally pulled the full file, his theft was sitting right there underneath her generosity. Damon's face had gone the color of ash. "This is absurd. You can't possibly believe." "I don't believe it," Marcus said quietly. "I have it documented. Every account, every intermediary, every signature." He turned toward Renata Cole, whose confident expression had collapsed entirely. "And I have a recording of a conversation 4 days ago in which the two of you discussed getting rid of the person you were both afraid might expose it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elias signaled quietly toward the ballroom's rear entrance, and 2 security officers stepped forward. "Federal fraud investigators have already been notified," Marcus continued, his voice never wavering. "This merger is suspended, pending a full audit of every transaction Damon Whitfield has touched in the last 3 years." He set the microphone down gently on the podium. As for tonight's celebration, I think we've all learned something considerably more valuable than a partnership agreement. Security moved in. Damon attempted briefly to argue, gesturing wildly toward guests who had, moments earlier, been raising glasses in his honor. None of them met his eyes now. Renata was escorted out through a side door, her face a mixture of fury and disbelief, the calculated composure she had carried into the ballroom completely gone. Marcus watched them go without any visible satisfaction. Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom entirely, leaving 200 stunned guests behind him, already reaching for his phone. He found Naomi Baxter sitting on the low stone wall outside the service entrance, a single cardboard box beside her containing 3 years of small, personal belongings, a spare cardigan, a framed photo of Patricia Reyes and the Riverside staff, a chipped mug she'd never bothered replacing. She looked up as his footsteps approached, and something in her face braced immediately for more bad news. "Mr. Kane, I don't understand what's happening. Your cousin said—" "My cousin lied to you," Marcus said, sitting down on the wall beside her, still in the formal suit he'd worn to a merger celebration that no longer existed. "He's been stealing from this company for 2 years, and he tried to have you fired to cover it up before I ever connected your paycheck to his fraud." Naomi stared at him. "My paycheck exposed him? Without you ever knowing it." Marcus allowed himself, for the first time all evening, something close to a genuine smile. "You spent 14 months trying to save a children's shelter, and in doing it, you accidentally built the exact evidence trail my security team needed to catch a man who's been robbing this family for years." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh, somewhere between shock and relief. "I really did think I was going to be arrested tonight." "You were never going to be arrested." Marcus's expression sobered. "I owe you an apology I don't think will ever be big enough. You were fired, using my name, for the single most selfless thing anyone in that house has done in years. And it happened because I wasn't paying close enough attention to know who I was trusting with the people who work for me." Naomi looked down at the cardboard box between her hands. "I don't need an apology, Mr. Kane. You're getting one anyway." He stood, extending a hand to help her up. "And you're getting your job back, effective immediately, along with something else." "What's that?" "Riverside Children's Shelter is about to receive a very different kind of donation," Marcus said. "Not from you, from Kane Industries. Enough to keep every bed filled for the next decade, and enough left over to expand it." He paused. "I'd like you to help me decide how." Naomi's eyes filled, though she fought it, the way she fought most things, quietly, without drama. "You don't have to do that because of me." "I'm not doing it because of you," Marcus said gently. "I'm doing it because you spent 14 months teaching me exactly what loyalty is supposed to look like, and I'd like this family's name attached to something worth that lesson." 6 months later, the Riverside Children's Shelter looked almost unrecognizable. New beds filled a renovated second floor. A fully staffed kitchen served 3 proper meals a day instead of 2. A small plaque near the entrance read simply, "For every kid who needs 1 more year to find their footing." No names attached, at Naomi's insistence. She still worked at Kane Estate, though her role had changed considerably. Marcus had quietly created a position, Director of Household and Community Affairs, that let her split her time between managing his home and overseeing the shelter's new expansion, a job that fit her exactly the way her old uniform never quite had. Patricia Reyes still ran daily operations, though now with an actual budget instead of a prayer and a lockbox. On Friday mornings, Naomi still made the same trip east, though these days it wasn't to hand over an envelope of her own paycheck. It was simply to read to the kids during breakfast, the way a volunteer once had for her, 11 years earlier. Marcus came with her more often than either of them had expected he would. He was terrible at reading aloud, stiff and overly formal, and the kids teased him mercilessly for it, something none of his executives would ever have dared to do. He didn't seem to mind at all. One Friday afternoon, sitting on the shelter's front steps after breakfast had ended, Marcus watched Naomi laughing with a group of kids gathered around her, and found himself thinking, not for the first time, about the exact moment he'd stood in that security office reading a flagged transfer report, certain he was about to uncover either theft or coercion. He had found neither. He had found, instead, the single most loyal, quietly extraordinary person operating inside his entire empire, hidden in plain sight for 3 years, because no one, including him, had ever thought to ask a housekeeper what she did with the money she earned. "You're staring," Naomi said, sitting down beside him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "I'm thinking. About the merger? About how close I came to never finding out who you actually were." He accepted the coffee she handed him. "You could have worked in my house for another 10 years, and I would have kept thinking of you as excellent staff and nothing more, if a fraud audit hadn't accidentally shown me the truth." Naomi considered that for a moment. "Would it have mattered? If you'd never found out?" "It would have mattered to me," Marcus said quietly. "Even if you never knew it," she smiled, looking back out toward the shelter's front lawn, where a group of children were chasing each other across grass that had, until recently, been little more than dirt and weeds. "I never did it to be found out," she said. "I know," Marcus answered. "That's exactly why it mattered." Behind them, the shelter buzzed with the ordinary, unglamorous sound of children being fed, taught, and kept safe. The same sound that had once, 11 years earlier, saved the life of a frightened 15-year-old girl who grew up believing that kindness only counted when nobody was watching. She had been wrong about one thing. Someone had finally been watching all along. And what he found had shut down not just a boardroom, but an entire conspiracy, built on the assumption that the quiet people in powerful houses would always be too invisible to matter.